The doors of the grand tribunal hall opened with a deep, heavy sound, like the groan of something ancient being disturbed. Two Velthari guards walked in first, their tall bodies moving smoothly, their silver armor catching the light from the crystal walls. Between them, they pulled a human woman. Her name was Sergeant Ilara Voss. She was not walking freely. Magnetic restraints locked around her wrists and ankles, and a thin metal bar connected them, forcing her steps to be small and slow. Her uniform was dark green, torn at the shoulder, dirty with soot and dried blood. A cut ran from her left temple down to her jaw, healed just enough to stop bleeding but still raw and red. Her dark hair was loose, half of it stuck to the side of her face. She looked like someone who had been through something terrible. She did not look broken. The hall was enormous. The ceiling rose so high that the top of it was hidden in pale, bluish shadow. The walls were made of crystal that had been carved and shaped over hundreds of years, and they caught every sound and bounced it softly through the room, so that even a whisper could be heard clearly from far away. Rows of seats rose on both sides in wide, curved tiers, like a theater built for judgment. Every seat was filled. There were hundreds of them, alien diplomats, military officers, court officials, advisors, and observers from dozens of species who had come to watch. Some had 4 eyes, some had none. Some were tall and thin, others wide and heavy. Their clothing ranged from ceremonial robes to decorated armor. Many of them had never seen a human up close before. They all stared at Ilara as she was brought to the center of the hall. The floor there was open and round like a stage, and Ilara was placed in the middle of it. The guards stepped back. She stood alone under the light, her restrained hands in front of her, her eyes moving slowly across the room. She was not panicking, she was looking. At the very front of the hall, elevated above everything else on a wide throne seat made of black stone and gold metal, sat the High Arbiter, Counselor Dreth Vaughn. He was old for his species, with 4 pale iridescent eyes that caught the light like wet glass. His robes were deep purple, layered and precise, and a long ceremonial chain hung across his chest. He looked at the human the way someone looks at a small animal that has wandered into a very serious room. He let the silence sit for a moment, then he spoke. His voice was translated through the room systems in smooth, flat tones. The Velthari Dominion calls this session to order. The matter before this court involves the unauthorized entry of a Terran vessel into protected Dominion space. 1 survivor has been recovered. He paused, letting his eyes settle on Ilara. This individual will be assessed, charged, and sentenced according to Dominion law. A murmur moved through the crowd, not concern, amusement. One of the Velthari generals, a broad-shouldered figure named Velkashari, leaned toward his aide and said something quietly. The aide clicked its teeth together, the Velthari expression for laughter. Several others nearby did the same. A diplomat from the Seren delegation, a species with pale blue skin and wide, flat heads, turned to his colleague and whispered loudly enough for the translation system to catch it. "Is that what their soldiers look like? I expected something larger." More laughter. It spread through the tiers like a slow wave. Someone in the upper gallery made a sound, a low, mocking call, imitating what they seemed to think a human war cry sounded like. Others joined in, turning it into a kind of game, each one trying to make the sound more ridiculous than the last. The hall filled briefly with noise. Ilara stood still. She did not flinch. She did not look down. She did not clench her jaw or tighten her fists or do any of the small things people do when they are trying very hard not to react. She simply stood there, her eyes continuing their slow, quiet sweep of the room. She was counting exits. She was not in guard positions. She was watching which of the observers leaned forward and which ones leaned back. She was reading the room the way a soldier reads terrain, not with anger, not with fear, but with the calm, focused attention of someone who is still working. Dreth Vaughn raised one hand and the noise settled. He looked back at Ilara with an expression that might have been pity. if pity could also be contempt. Humanity, he said, and the word landed like something being set down carelessly, has been among the stars for less than 2 of their centuries. They have no seat in the interstellar compact. They hold no recognized territory. They have no formal military treaty with any dominion-aligned species. He folded his hands on the arm of his throne. And yet, they sent a warship into our space. He tilted his head slightly. One warship. The hall reacted again, this time with a deeper, more comfortable kind of amusement, the kind that comes from feeling very certain. General Velkashari stood briefly and addressed the court. For the record, he said, his voice carrying easily through the crystal hall, the Dominion dispatched 17 warships to intercept and disable the Terran vessel. The engagement lasted approximately 4 hours. He paused for effect. The human ship has been destroyed. Its crew is accounted for. This woman is the only one who required a personal escort. He sat back down, and those around him acknowledged this with approving sounds. The implication was clear. 17 ships for one, and they were still laughing about it. Dreth Vaughn looked back at Alara. He spread his hands in a gesture of formal openness. Before this court passes judgment, he said, tradition allows the subject to speak. If you have anything to say, human, the Dominion will hear it. He said it the way someone offers a child a chance to explain why they drew on the wall. Not because the answer matters, because it is polite to ask. The hall went quiet, not out of respect, out of curiosity. They wanted to see what the small, damaged creature would do. Would she cry? Would she beg? Would she say something confused and primitive that they could talk about later? Alara raised her eyes. She looked up from the floor and looked at the gallery slowly, from one side to the other, like she was making sure she had seen all of it. Then she looked at Dreth Vaughn directly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just clear. "I'd like to know," she said, "how many of your 17 ships made it home?" The question sat in the air. For just a moment, a single strange moment, the hall was completely silent. Then someone laughed and the spell broke and the noise came back, louder and more dismissive than before. The question was waved off. The comment was ignored. A Velthari official near the back made a gesture that meant, roughly, she doesn't even understand where she is. Dreth Vaughn allowed himself a small smile and moved to call the next formal step in the proceedings. But not everyone was laughing. In a side corridor just off the main hall, a Velthari intelligence officer named Commander Sethorin had stopped walking. He had heard the question through the hall's speakers. He stood with a data slate in his hand, looking at the doorway that led to the tribunal floor. He had been assigned to pull the human service record before the sentencing. He had not read it yet. He turned and walked quickly back toward his office. The office was small and cold, the way most working rooms in Velthari military stations tended to be, practical, with no decoration beyond what was required. A single desk, a data terminal, a narrow window that looked out onto the docking arms of the station. Commander Sethorin sat down, placed the data slate flat on the desk, and pulled up the human service file on the terminal. He expected it to take a few minutes to review. It was a formality, after all. The court had already decided the outcome. His job was simply to add the file to the official record, rank, assignment history, maybe a list of the engagements the ship had been involved in. Standard documentation. He began to read. The young scribe assigned to him, a thin Velthari named Veth, stood at the far side of the desk and watched quietly. Veth was still in training and had never attended a tribunal session before today. The whole thing had seemed exciting to him, a real human, right here on the station, standing in the grand hall. He had told his bunkmates about it that morning. He was still in a good mood. Sethorin was not in a good mood anymore. He leaned forward slowly as he read, his 4 eyes moving across the screen in tight, focused passes. His posture changed. His breathing slowed. Alara Voss, Sergeant First Class, Terran Armed Forces, 9th Deep Range Division. 12 years of service, 12 years. Sethorin had assumed she was young. She looked young, even damaged and dirty as she was. But 12 years meant she had joined the military when humans were still in the early stages of building their first deep-range fleet. She had been a soldier longer than most Velthari officers in the hall had been in their current ranks. He scrolled further. The Kepler Corridor skirmishes. 3 separate engagements spread over 8 months against a rival human faction during a period of internal conflict. She had served as a ground infantry soldier during that period, fighting in conditions that the file described as extreme atmospheric hostility, a polite way of saying the planet's air was barely breathable and the terrain was mostly volcanic rock. Her unit had a 40% casualty rate. She was not among them. He scrolled again. Siege of Halo Station. Sethorin had heard of this one briefly, through intelligence summaries. A human-built orbital station that had been seized by a corporate military group during a territorial dispute. Regular Terran forces had spent 60 days retaking it floor by floor. The fighting had been close, ugly, and extremely costly. Alara had been a squad leader by then. Her record showed she had personally pulled 4 injured soldiers out of a collapsed section while the section was still on fire. He scrolled again. Kashin IV. Sethorin stopped. He had read more detailed intelligence on this one. The war on Kashin IV was the conflict that had first made Velthari military analysts take a second, harder look at humanity. A coalition of 3 alien species, none of them Dominion-aligned, but all of them more advanced than humans at the time, had attempted to establish a mining settlement on a human-claimed planet. The humans had refused to leave. The coalition had sent ground forces. What followed was 3 years of war. 3 years, with no reinforcements reaching the human side for the first 18 months due to supply route disruptions. The humans were outnumbered. Their equipment was older. They were fighting on their own planet, which helped, but only so much when the enemy has superior air support. They won. Not by luck, not by a single decisive moment. They won slowly, month by month, by refusing to collapse, by adapting, by doing things that the coalition's military models had not accounted for, digging deeper, moving at night, using the planet's weather patterns in ways that took years to understand. By the time reinforcements finally arrived, the human ground forces had already broken the coalition's southern flank on their own. Alara had been there for all 3 years. Sethorin sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at the screen. He kept reading. 3 confirmed solo survival events. The first, her transport ship was destroyed during a pirate engagement near the outer colonies. She was the only person from her section who made it to an emergency pod. The pod systems were damaged. She kept herself alive in open space for 19 days before a rescue ship found her. The file noted that her physical and psychological condition upon recovery was described by the medical team as unexpected. She was weakened, but calm. She had used the pod's remaining power only for essential life support, rationing it carefully enough to extend her survival window by an estimated 6 days beyond standard projections. The second, a ground mission gone wrong on a jungle moon. Her team was split by a flash flood. She was alone for 31 days. She came out thinner, with 2 cracked ribs and a deep infection in her left hand, but she came out walking and she came out with the mission data intact. The third Sethorin did not read all the way through. The summary was enough. She had survived something she should not have survived, and she had done it by being methodical when anyone else would have panicked. Veth had moved closer to the desk. He was reading over Sethorin's shoulder now, which was technically inappropriate, but Sethorin did not send him away. He found, strangely, that he did not want to be alone with this information. The Battle of Iridian Reach, Veth said quietly, reading the next entry. His voice had changed. The excitement was gone from it. Sethorin read it with him. Iridian Reach was a skirmish, small by most standards, barely worth a full page in a military history, a defensive position on a rocky ridge overlooking a civilian evacuation route. Ilara's unit had been holding the ridge. The enemy, a mechanized infantry force with automated drone support, had hit them hard and fast. Within the first hour, most of the unit was down, either dead or unable to fight. Ilara had held the ridge alone for 6 hours. The file was precise about this. Not approximately 6 hours, not several hours. 6 hours, 14 minutes, confirmed by her unit's communication logs and the timestamp on the evacuation shuttle's departure record. She had held a single defensive position, alone, against a mechanized force with drone support, for 6 hours and 14 minutes, until the last civilian transport was clear. She had used everything available to her. She had moved constantly, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted effectively. She had used the terrain to make the enemy uncertain about how many defenders there actually were. She had destroyed 3 drones with standard equipment. And when her weapons ran out of power, she had killed one of the HFY War drones, a machine standing nearly 3 meters tall, built for close combat, with a field knife. The file had a medical note attached to that entry. She had broken 2 fingers and her left collarbone in that encounter. She had not reported the injuries until the evacuation was confirmed complete. Veth did not say anything. He just stood there very still. Sethorin scrolled to the final entry, the UES Relentless, her most recent assignment, the ship that the Dominion's 17 warships had destroyed. The crew had been 41 people, not all combat-rated. Some were engineers, a medic, 2 navigation specialists. When the ship was hit, it was already burning in 3 sections. The escape pods could only be accessed from 2 of those sections. The 3rd section was cut off. 11 people had been trapped in the cut-off section. Ilara had gone back in. The file did not describe exactly how. The details were fragmented, pulled from the survivors' statements. But across all of them, the picture was the same. She had moved through a ship that was actively breaking apart, in zero-gravity sections where the atmosphere was venting, and she had gotten those 11 people to an emergency hatch. 23 of the 41 crew members made it to escape pods. 23 people were alive right now, because of what she had done in those final minutes on a burning ship. And then she had been captured. Sethorin closed the file. He sat very still for a long moment. Through the walls of the station, faintly, he could still hear the sounds from the tribunal hall. The court was still in session. Someone was still talking in that smooth, superior tone that courts used when they were very certain of themselves. Veth spoke first. His voice was careful now, like someone stepping onto ice they are not sure will hold. "Why does it matter?" he asked. "She's just one soldier, one human." Sethorin did not answer right away. He picked up his communicator from the edge of the desk. He looked at the door. He thought about the question Ilara had asked the court, how many of your 17 ships made it home, and he thought about the fact that no one had answered her, because everyone had assumed it was confusion or defiance or some kind of naive bluster. He was no longer assuming that. "Because no one told the court," he said quietly, "what she survived to get here." He opened the communicator and requested an urgent private channel to the arbiter's personal aide. He needed to speak with Dreth Vaughn before the sentencing moved any further. He walked out of the office quickly, leaving Veth alone with the file still glowing on the screen. Veth looked at it for a long time. Then he looked toward the hall. Then he looked back at the file again, and something in his expression shifted, the last small trace of amusement gone, replaced by something he did not quite have a word for yet. Something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of respect. The tribunal hall had settled back into its formal rhythm by the time Sethorin returned. The early noise and laughter had faded into the composed, ceremonial tone that the court preferred, the tone of an institution that was very sure of its own importance. Dreth Vaughn sat in his elevated seat, with the relaxed posture of someone reading through a routine administrative matter. Several officials in the lower tiers were making notes on their data slates. A few in the upper gallery had begun quiet conversations among themselves, no longer finding the human interesting enough to watch closely. Ilara was still standing in the center of the floor. She had not moved. Her restrained hands were still folded in front of her, the magnetic bar between her wrists holding her arms in place. Her feet were set slightly apart, not a defiant stance, just a balanced one, the unconscious habit of someone trained to be stable on uncertain ground. Her eyes moved steadily around the room, slow and unhurried, taking in everything. General Velkashari was now speaking formally for the record. He stood at a podium to the left of the main floor, his decorated uniform catching the pale light from the crystal walls. He had a broad, confident voice that carried easily, and he used it the way powerful people use confident voices, not to inform, but to confirm what everyone already believed. The Terran species, he said, represents no credible strategic threat to the Velthari Dominion or its aligned partners at this time. Their technology is 2 generations behind current Dominion standard. Their fleet consists of fewer than 60 vessels capable of deep-range travel. They have no established diplomatic relationships within the compact. And as this engagement has demonstrated, he gestured loosely toward Ilara, their military judgment is, at best, poorly calibrated. Polite sounds of agreement moved through the tiers. This trial, Velkashari continued, serves primarily as a formal warning. The sentence passed here today will be transmitted to Earth's governing bodies along with a clear statement of Dominion territorial boundaries. It is the position of this court that one such warning will be sufficient. Humans, whatever their limitations, are capable of understanding consequences. He allowed himself a small pause, the kind that lets an audience appreciate the precision of what has just been said. Then he sat down. Drethvon nodded slowly and began assembling the formal language of a sentence. That was the moment Sethorin entered the hall. He moved quickly but quietly along the edge of the floor, staying out of the center light, and approached the Arbiter's elevated seat from the side. One of Drethvon's personal aides intercepted him, but Sethorin was already holding out the data slate with both hands, his expression flat and deliberate, the face of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. The aide looked at him for a moment, then took the slate and turned to pass it upward. Drethvon accepted it without interrupting his review of the formal proceedings. He glanced down at the slate. He stopped. His 4 pale eyes moved across the screen. His expression did not change, which, for a Velthari arbiter with decades of court experience, was itself a kind of change. He read for several seconds. Then he read again. Then he set the slate carefully on the arm of his seat and looked up. He said nothing. He did not resume the formal language he had been assembling. He simply sat very still. Velkashari, who had not seen any of this, felt the silence extend past its normal length and looked up from his own notes. He glanced at the Arbiter. The Arbiter's expression told him nothing. He looked back at his notes, decided the pause was simply procedural, and chose to fill it. "With the court's permission," he said, rising slightly, "I would add one final observation for the record. The human vessel entered Dominion space alone, a single ship. One could argue that this speaks to the depth of their misunderstanding of the situation." He looked toward Ilara with the expression of someone being generous. They do not yet know what they are dealing with. The hall began to stir with quiet agreement. Ilara spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not shift her position. She simply spoke into the room, and the crystal walls carried it to every corner with perfect, merciless clarity. "We sent one ship," she said, "because one ship was all this border needed. We did not know you would send 17. The stirring stopped. Velkashari turned toward her slowly. Her voice remained level, not aggressive, not shaking, Just clear, the way facts are clear when they have been organized carefully by someone who has had a long time to think. 4 of your 17 warships did not return, she said. 2 were recovered and sent to your maintenance yards, where your engineers are still assessing the structural damage. The remaining 11 returned to their home stations, but not one of them is currently rated for active deployment. She paused for just a moment. Your fleet expended 9 months of munitions reserves in a 4-hour engagement with 1 human frigate. The crew of that frigate numbered 41 people. Most of them were not combat-rated. The hall was very quiet now. Not the polite quiet of a formal proceeding. A different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when a room full of people simultaneously realizes they may have been looking at something wrong. Velkashari's posture had changed. He was no longer relaxed. He was holding very still, in the way that people hold still when they are trying to think quickly without letting anyone see them doing it. Those numbers, he said carefully, are available in your own fleet's incident reports, Alara said. I read them. Your ships transmitted standard post-engagement data automatically. The Relentless picked up the signal packets before she went down. She looked at him steadily. You have a gap in your encryption between primary and secondary transmission protocols. Your engineers have not patched it yet. The silence deepened. Drethvon had not moved. He was watching Alara with an expression that no longer resembled the one he had worn when she first entered the hall. The formal patience was still there, but behind it something else had replaced the contempt, something more careful, something closer to attention. Alara let the silence sit for exactly long enough. Then she continued. I am not here because you caught me. Her voice was the same, steady, unhurried, simple. I am here because I allowed your crew to bring me aboard. I needed to see the layout of this station. I needed to know which corridors connect the command levels to the docking arms where the emergency power relays are positioned, and how many guards rotate through the lower security checkpoints. She tilted her head slightly. I have been here for 11 hours. That was enough time. No one in the gallery moved. Velkashari's voice came out differently than before, lower, stripped of the ceremonial weight it had been carrying all session. What does that mean? Drethvon spoke before Alara could answer. His voice was quiet and precise. It means, he said, that she is not a prisoner. He looked at Velkashari, then back at Alara. It means we invited her in. Alara nodded once, just a small, simple nod. I also sent a signal, she said, 40 minutes ago, from the communicator I kept in the lining of my left boot. The restraints locked my arms in a position that made it reachable. She said this without apology, without satisfaction, just as a fact that the room needed to have. The signal tells my command that I am alive and that I have the station's layout data. Drethvon's eyes moved to the guards by the door. He did not need to speak. They were already moving, but the expression on his face was not one of anger. It was the expression of someone rapidly recalculating, running numbers in their head, trying to find a position that still made sense. The upper gallery, which had been laughing less than an hour ago, was absolutely still. No clicking of teeth. No mimicked sounds. Just rows of alien faces, looking down at a single human woman in magnetic restraints who had just told them, calmly, plainly, with no drama at all, that they had made a serious mistake. Velkashari sat down heavily. He did not speak again. Drethvon looked at Alara for a long moment. The data slate with her service record was still resting on the arm of his seat. He had not finished reading it when Sethorin delivered it, but he had read enough. Enough to understand that the court had been treating a measurement tool as a trophy, and the measurement had already been taken. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its formal ceremony. He sounded, for the first time, like someone having a real conversation. What is it that you want? He asked. Alara looked at him the way she had been looking at the room since she arrived, steady, observant, patient. An appointment, she said, with whoever actually makes decisions here. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. The guard stopped moving when Drethvon raised his hand. He did not give the signal loudly or with any particular drama. He simply raised one hand, fingers spread, and the two guards who had been crossing toward Alara halted mid-step. They looked at the Arbiter. He looked at them steadily. They stepped back to their positions by the door. The gallery above watched all of this in complete silence. Drethvon descended from his elevated seat slowly, using the wide stone steps on its left side, and walked to the center of the floor. He had not done this during any of the session. An arbiter, as a rule, did not leave his seat during formal proceedings. His feet on the floor at the same level as a prisoner was a gesture that everyone in the room understood, even if they were not sure yet what it meant. He stopped a few meters from Alara and looked at her directly. "You will speak," he said, "and this court will listen." Behind him in the tiers, a few officials exchanged uncertain glances. A senior Velthari diplomat near the front began to rise with an objection already forming, but Sethorin, standing to the side of the hall, made a short, sharp gesture, and the diplomat read something in his face and sat back down without speaking. Alara looked at Drethvon. Then she looked at the gallery, not the way she had looked at it when she first came in, cataloging and measuring. This time she looked at it the way someone looks at a room when they are about to say something they need the room to hear. She began to speak. Her voice was still the same, no performance in it, no anger, no pride, nothing dramatic. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are very tired and very certain at the same time. "You have been calling humans a young species," she said. "And in one way that is true. We have been in space for less than 200 years, but that is only one number." She paused. "The other number is 30,000. She let that sit for a moment. 30,000 years of recorded conflict on our own planet, wars that lasted generations, diseases that killed half a continent in one winter, ice ages that drove our ancestors into caves and left them with nothing but fire and the decision to keep moving. We are not new to hardship. We are very, very old at surviving it." No one in the room spoke. "Your intelligence reports on humanity measured our technology," she continued. "Our ship designs, our weapons systems, our communication networks. Those are fair things to measure, but they are not the thing that determines what a species does when it is under pressure." She looked at Drethvon steadily. "You measured our tools. You did not measure us." Velkashari, still seated, was looking at the floor. His hands were folded in his lap. He did not look up. "There is a word in our language," Alara said. "Grief. It means the pain of losing something or someone that mattered to you. All species that we have encountered have a version of this experience. But in most of them, including yours, grief has a strong effect on function. It slows decision-making. It disrupts coordination. It is effectively a temporary loss of capacity." She paused. "In humans, grief does not work that way. We carry it and we keep moving. We have been doing this since before written language. We name our dead and we march forward. Not because we feel less, we feel more, if anything. But we learned, over 30,000 years of not having any other choice, how to hold loss and continue functioning at the same time." A Velthari military analyst in the third tier had taken out a recording device. He was not hiding it. Several others were paying close attention in ways they had not been an hour ago, not with amusement, but with the focused, unguarded attention of people encountering something they had not prepared for. "Your fleet's psychological models for combat behavior do not account for this," Alara said. "We know this because we have studied your models. You project that a crew sustaining over 50% casualties will experience a critical loss of combat effectiveness within 20 minutes. For most species in your records, that is probably accurate." She tilted her head slightly. "The Relentless sustained 63% casualties in the first 40 minutes of engagement. The ship continued offensive and defensive operations for 3 hours and 20 minutes after that." She did not say this to wound. She said it the way a doctor reads a chart because the information is relevant, and ignoring it helps no one. You've been watching your borders for 11 years, she said. Not with hostility, with the same careful attention we give to any neighbor we do not yet know. We watched your patrol patterns, your response times, your fleet movements near contested zones. We watched how you handled the Seren boundary dispute 4 years ago, and the Kethalor mining incident 2 years before that. We watched how long your political processes take and how your military and civilian leadership communicate with each other. Drethvon spoke carefully. You were conducting surveillance. We were learning, Alara said. There is a difference. Surveillance implies preparation for attack. We were preparing for the possibility that we would eventually need to talk to you. She met his eyes directly. The relentless was not a provocation. It was a measurement. We needed to know specifically how your rapid response fleet would react to a vessel that did not behave predictably, how many ships you would commit, how quickly. Whether your commanders in the field had independent decision-making authority or waited for instruction from the station. She paused. We learned what we needed to learn. The arbiter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was not formal anymore. It was the voice of a person asking a genuine question. And what did you learn? That your rapid response protocol commits significantly more resources than necessary as a show of force, she said. Which means your command structure values perception of strength over efficiency. That is useful to know. It tells us how you think about your own power, and therefore how you think about ours. The arbiter looked at her for a long time. You said earlier that you sent a signal, he said. That your command now knows you are alive and that you have the station's layout. Yes. What will they do with that information? Alara answered without hesitation because it was not a complicated question. Whatever I tell them to do, I am the senior officer on this mission. Until a relief ship arrives, I am the only Terran voice in this system. Velkashari looked up from the floor for the first time in several minutes. His expression was the expression of someone who has spent a long session being very wrong and is now trying to decide how to sit with that. He looked at Alara and asked, with none of his earlier ceremony, "And what will you tell them?" She considered the question for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to give it correctly. That depends entirely, she said, on what happens in the next conversation. Drethvon turned to look at Sethorin, still standing at the edge of the hall. Sethorin gave a small, careful nod, the nod of someone who has been saying something quietly for the last hour and is relieved to see it finally landing. The arbiter looked back at Alara. The session around them, the formal language, the tiered gallery, the charges, the sentencing, all of it had become, in the last few minutes, entirely beside the point. The room knew it. Even those in the upper gallery who had been laughing were no longer thinking about the court proceedings. They were thinking about something else entirely. Drethvon spoke quietly. You are prepared to negotiate. I am prepared, Alara said, to have a real conversation. There is a difference. She said it without any sharpness, simply repeating his own distinction back to him, gently, as a correction offered between equals. Negotiation implies that both sides want something from each other. I'm not here to want things from you. I am here to find out whether the Velthari Dominion and humanity are the kind of neighbors who can talk honestly. She looked at him steadily. That question can still go either way. Drethvon was quiet. Then he did something that no one in the hall expected. He reached across and with a slow and deliberate motion pressed the release on Alara's wrist restraints. The magnetic bar clicked open. Her hands were free. She did not move them immediately. She simply looked at him. There is a private council chamber on the level below this hall, he said. I will have it prepared. We will speak there without ceremony. He glanced at the gallery above, then back at her. You have my word that you will leave this station safely regardless of the outcome. Alara looked at his face for a moment, reading it the way she had been reading the room all morning. Then she nodded once. It was a small nod, simple, but it meant she believed him. And in that small exchange, without any formal language at all, the actual conversation between humanity and the Velthari Dominion had already begun. The private council chamber was smaller than the tribunal hall in every way: smaller ceiling, smaller table, smaller windows. But it was a different kind of smaller, not diminished, focused. The kind of room where things actually got decided, as opposed to the kind of room where decisions already made were announced with ceremony. The table was long and dark, made from something that looked like compressed stone with faint silver lines running through it. Chairs lined both sides. The windows on the far wall looked out onto open space, the black between stars, with a slow curve of the planet Soveth Prime visible at the lower edge, its surface a pale amber color from this distance. Ilara sat on one side. She had been given a glass of water, which she drank without comment. Across from her sat Dreth Vaughn, his ceremonial chain still around his neck but his posture different, less elevated, more settled. Beside him were 3 members of the Velthari High Council, introduced briefly by title, their faces carrying the particular expression of powerful people who were not accustomed to being surprised and were still adjusting to having been surprised very recently. Seth Oren sat at the far end of the table, slightly back from the others, a data slate in front of him. He was there to observe and record, but Ilara had noticed, from the moment she entered, that he was the most alert person in the room. At the other end of the table, by the chamber's secondary door, a Terran diplomatic shuttle had been permitted to dock 30 minutes ago. 2 people had come off it, a communications officer who set up a small encrypted terminal in the corner and then stepped back against the wall, and a Terran civilian diplomat named Counselor Marin Joel, a small, quiet woman with short silver hair and the kind of patient face that comes from spending a long career listening carefully to difficult conversations. She sat beside Ilara, folded her hands on the table, and waited. She had not said much since arriving. She did not need to. Her presence meant that Earth already knew enough to send someone with authority, which meant the signal Ilara had sent had been received and acted on in less than 40 minutes, which meant the Terran fleet had someone close enough to this system to respond that quickly. Everyone at the table understood what that implied, and no one said it aloud, because saying it would have changed the tone in a way that none of them wanted. One of the High Council members, a woman with wide, pale green eyes and silver markings across her temples, spoke first. Her name was Counselor Yethavon, and of the 3 council members present, she had looked the most composed since entering the room. "We understand," she said, "that the engagement involving the Terran vessel was more costly than initial reports indicated." "Yes," Ilara said, simply that. Yethavon looked at her for a moment. The Dominion does not typically acknowledge operational costs in preliminary sessions. "That's fine," Ilara said. "We already have the numbers." A brief silence. Then Yethavon nodded once and moved on in the way that practical people move on when a point has been clearly established. The incident at the border was not sanctioned by the High Council. The rapid response order came from Regional Military Command, acting within their standard authority parameters. "We know," Counselor Joel said. It was the first time she had spoken, and her voice was quiet and even. "Regional Command saw an unauthorized vessel and responded. That is reasonable. The scale of the response is what required attention." 17 ships, said the second council member, an older male with deep gray coloring and a formal posture that had not relaxed since he sat down. "For 1 frigate," Ilara said, not as an accusation, just as a number that needed to be present in the room. The older council member looked at her steadily. "Your vessel destroyed 4 Dominion warships." "Yes," Ilara said again. He waited as though expecting more. She did not add more. She had found, over 12 years of military experience, that one of the most effective things a person could do in a difficult conversation was to simply confirm a fact without apologizing for it. Apologies invited negotiation over whether the fact was as bad as it seemed. Calm confirmation said, "It is what it is. Now what do we do about it?" Sethorin, at the far end of the table, was watching Alara with the same careful attention he had been giving her since reading her file that morning. He was watching the way she sat, the way she let silences stand, the way she did not fill space with unnecessary words. He was a trained intelligence officer, which meant he was trained to read people, and what he was reading in Alara Voss was something he did not have a category for yet. Drethvon spoke. The Dominion is prepared to formally acknowledge the need for boundary negotiation. The current territorial lines in the relevant sector were drawn before humanity reached deep range capability. They are, by any honest measure, outdated. Counselor Joel leaned forward slightly. "We appreciate that acknowledgement." "The matter of the destroyed ships," said the third council member, who had not spoken until now, a younger male with a sharp, careful face, "will require formal discussion. Reparations, if any, need to be established through recognized protocol." "Agreed," said Joel. "That discussion should include the Relentless and her crew." "Also agreed," said Yethavon. She looked at Alara when she said it, not at Joel. "The surviving crew members are being held in medical quarters on the station's lower level. They are unharmed. They will be released to your shuttle before you depart." Alara received this information and gave the same small nod she had given Drethvon in the tribunal hall. It was the only visible change in her expression. But Sethorin, watching from the end of the table, noted that her shoulders dropped by approximately 2 millimeters, the only sign she had given, across the entire day, that she had been carrying something she was relieved to set down. The formal session continued for another 2 hours. Territory lines were discussed. Communication protocols were proposed. A preliminary framework for establishing official diplomatic contact between humanity and the Dominion, something that had never existed before today, was sketched out in careful, neutral language. There were points of friction. There were moments where one side or the other went quiet and the room held its breath, but it moved forward. As the session wound toward its close, Drethvon made a formal statement for the record, read from a prepared document that one of his aides had been drafting quietly on a data slate throughout the session. "The Velthari Dominion," the statement said, "formally recognized humanity as a sovereign peer species under interstellar compact law. It was, by any measure, the fastest such recognition in Dominion history. The previous record had taken 11 years of diplomatic groundwork and 3 formal petitions." Alara, sitting across the table, did not react to the announcement with any visible emotion. She simply listened, and when it was done, she nodded her head once in acknowledgement. Counselor Joel quietly pressed a button on the encrypted terminal in the corner. The communication would reach Earth within the hour. History was traveling at the speed of light. When the session ended and people began to rise from the table, Sethorin walked to the door and then paused. He waited until Joel had moved ahead and Alara was walking just behind her. Then he fell into step beside Alara for a moment, because there was one question he had not been able to stop thinking about all day, and he had decided, somewhere during the last 2 hours, that he was going to ask it. "Were you afraid?" he said quietly, "in the hall this morning when they brought you in?" Alara walked for a few steps before answering. She did not seem surprised by the question. "The whole time," she said. He looked at her. "You did not show it." She considered that for a moment. "Fear is information," she said. "It tells you what matters. It tells you what to pay attention to." She glanced at him briefly. "You do not have to obey it. You just have to listen to it." Sethorin was quiet. He was filing that away carefully, not as a tactical note, not as an intelligence observation, but as something personal, something he would think about later when the day's events had settled. Alara and Joel walked through the secondary door and down the corridor toward the docking bay. The 23 surviving crew members of the UES Relentless were waiting there, some on crutches, some with bandaged arms, all of them pale and tired and alive. When Alara walked through the docking bay door, a few of them straightened. One, a young engineer with a bandage covering half his face, started to say something and then seemed to decide against it. He just nodded at her. She nodded back. They boarded the shuttle quietly. Behind them, the station settled into the particular stillness that comes after something significant has happened. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room where everyone is still processing what they just saw. In the tribunal hall above, the crystal walls caught the last light of Soveth Prime's sun as it moved through its slow arc. The tiers were empty now. The throne seat at the front stood unoccupied. The floor in the center, where Alara had stood in magnetic restraints for the better part of a morning, was smooth and plain and quiet. The court had come together to pass judgment on a human soldier. They had ended the day, recognizing her species as equals. No single person in the hall had chosen for things to go this way. No speech had convinced them. No dramatic gesture had won them over. What had changed them was something simpler and harder to argue with, the slow, unavoidable realization that they had looked at something and seen only what they expected to see, and that what was actually there was something else entirely. The shuttle disengaged from the docking arm and moved out into open space. Through its small windows, the stars were steady and cold and indifferent, the way stars always are, not impressed by anything, not paying attention to any particular species on any particular day. But the day had happened anyway, and the silence it left behind was not the silence of nothing having been said. It was the silence of everything having been understood.